Hi, I'm Andrew with Odd Harmonics, and in this video, I'll show you how to make triggers in Nexus. As you probably remember, triggers tell macros when to run. One great thing about triggers is that multiple triggers can all point to the same macro. This simplifies your programming because you don't need to make a dedicated macro for each trigger. It's really easy to do updates later because you won't have to remember to make changes in multiple places. Alright, let's dive in. Now that we have some macros, let's make some triggers. The different types of triggers are found in the tabs across the top of Nexus. Let's start by making a clock trigger that runs a building startup macro each weekday morning at 8 a.m. Click New to make a new trigger. Then give it a name. Choose which macro you want to run. Choose which days, and at what time it should run. That's it. Tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., this trigger will run the building startup macro. If you want to turn off this particular clock trigger, but still want to keep it around to use later, you can disable the trigger with this button here. Nexus won't execute any triggers that are disabled. If you want to disable all the clock triggers all at once, there's a Master Enable in the Preferences tab. There's one Master Enable for each trigger type. Let's look at network triggers next. Network triggers are similar to clock triggers, except that instead of waiting for a certain time of day, network triggers will wait for a specific incoming TCP or UDP message. Let's make one. In this case, let's listen for a play music message from a show control device on the network. Click New to make a new trigger. Give it a name, and choose which macro you want it to run. Next, put in the message that you're expecting to receive. If you're not sure what that would be, check the transmitting device's manual. It should be listed there. In this case, I know the device is going to send Nexus play_music, so I'll type that in. This last IP address field is optional. It allows this network trigger to react only to messages from a certain IP address. Unless you have a particular need for it, you can just leave it blank. By default, Nexus will listen for incoming TCP and UDP messages on port 53500, but you can change that in the Preferences tab. Next, let's look at control triggers. Control triggers watch a control like a GPIO input or a meter, and then trigger when that control gets to a certain state. For example, let's say we want to send an email when it gets too loud. Make a new control trigger, name it, and pick which macro it will run. Next, choose which Q-SYS component it will watch. It can be any component with a unique custom name. For a refresher on component names, check out Tutorial 1. I'll choose this meter component here, and then choose which meter it should watch. Next, we'll set what state that meter needs to be in order to trigger the macro. In this case, let's choose greater than a value of 6 dB. For other control triggers, you might want to pick different characteristics, such as a Boolean of true. The last field is duration, which is the amount of time the control must be in that state in order for the macro to trigger. If you're familiar with audio compressors, it's the same thing as an attack time. In this case, I'll put in 10 seconds. That will ensure that something is playing consistently loud before triggering that email. That's it for control triggers. They're a great way to watch just about anything in a Q-SYS design. There are a couple of exceptions, though. There are two special types of triggers designed specifically to watch status and timecode. Let's look at status triggers first. Status triggers are nearly identical to control triggers, except status triggers are optimized to look just at a component's status. For example, let's say we want to run a macro when the core hardware might be starting to fail. Like usual, make a new trigger, name it, and pick the macro. Next, pick the core's status component from the component dropdown, and pick status from the control dropdown. In this case, choose the not equal to sign and pick 0 OK. This will trigger the macro whenever the core's status is not okay. In other words, compromised, in a fault, etc. That's it. We've just quickly built a way to monitor the core's hardware health. Next are timecode triggers. They work in a similar way. You know the drill. Create a new trigger, name it, and pick your macro. Next, choose a timecode reader component and enter in the timecode to watch for. As soon as that reader gets the timecode value, the macro will run. What's really cool about this method is that different triggers can watch different readers simultaneously. This is really handy when you have multiple timecodes running, for example while operating independent rooms in a 4D theater. Alright, let's move on to a different type of trigger, instant triggers. Instant triggers are a fast way to make buttons that have custom functionality. First, add the name that you'd like the button to display, and then assign a macro. If you like, you can also add a press and hold time, which is the amount of time that the button will need to be held down before the macro is triggered. You can also give the button a double tap prevent time. When you press the button, this setting will disable the button for a certain number of seconds before it can be triggered again. To give the end user access to these buttons, go to the offline mode and drag these buttons into the UCI. Resize and restyle them as you would any other button. Alright, that's it for instant triggers. The last trigger type is Q-lists, which are ordered lists of macros. Q-lists are great when you have a set of macros that you'll repeatedly do in a known order, for example in a theatrical show. To make a Q-list, click New and give it a name. Use this center section to add cues to the Q list. Click New to make a new cue. Give it a name, and choose a macro. Make a few more cues and put them in the order of your show. If you have multiple versions of your show, you can copy and paste a cue list and then adjust the new one as needed. Remember, different cue lists can point to the same macros, so later on it will be really easy to make changes across all your shows. This rightmost section is the cue list transport. You can copy and paste this into a UCI, giving an end user the ability to select a show, navigate through the cues, and execute those cues one at a time. Alright, that's it for this tutorial. Check out the next video in this series to learn how to use variables, a powerful tool for making your macros smart. For more information about Nexus or to buy a pro license, go to odd-harmonics.com. And if you have any questions, please email us at support@odd-harmonics.com. Thanks for watching.